has to be these long review periods because it's a fair trade type of thing, or it can't impede trade between nations. So they have to be given time to translate and understand all of these draft standards as they're coming through. So that was explained to me in mind-crushing detail earlier today. So I just summarized it for you, but that's one of the reasons why these things take so long to produce. It's deliberate, and it is because the World Trade Organization requires it. So that's, I guess, half the answer to that question, why it takes so long. The other half is obviously that has, very obvious drawbacks, in terms of keeping up with the industry. I think that that's why the ISO process essentially has the ability to produce revisions. And yes, those revisions will take equally as agonizing a time frame, but the theory is there's a trade-off between being able to not impede businesses by having unfair standards published too quickly that would discriminate against certain businesses in certain countries, and also keeping up with the technology. So that's a particular challenge, but there's a reason for it.
Thanks. So, Mike, there's been a lot of criticism that PCI doesn't change fast enough. And I believe it was recently announced we're switching from a 2-year cycle to a 3-year cycle, and I'm really curious on what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, certainly, and I was about to bring that point up. It's very true. They are talking about moving to a 3-year cycle. I got to tell you, again, tastes great, less filling, right? On one hand, people are constantly yelling and saying, "Hey, what about virtualization? What about cloud computing? What about molecular brain computing? Whatever the next thing is, right? How can my brain now be PCI compliant? The standard, it doesn't evolve fast enough." Well, I talk to clients on a regular basis that if we go back to them every year and say, "Oh, the standard changed, you need to make this requirement. You need to make this change to your organization. Oh, the standard changed, you need to make this change to your organization." They are basically want to feed us the piranha that they keep around just for when we arrive every year, and it's very, very difficult. So, one of the things that we have in between is the fact that, first off, there are other special interest groups, or there are the standards working groups that are creating these different documentations, these additional information. Second off, I would say that historically, and we can see this across multiple regulatory issues, is the comply or explain. If you look at the EU Data Privacy Directive 95, which was adopted by most European countries as well as South Africa, it relies on this comply or explain, right? So it goes to where NERC, I'm learning, talks about, where technically feasible. Instead of saying where technically feasible, we can say we're going to force it or explain why you can't do. And there's a report I was just working on this morning where they have multiple compensating controls in place to address their specific business environment. So I guess it's a long-winded way of saying, although the standard may not change as quickly, right, we still have that flexibility of controls to maintain us throughout that changing environment.
Okay. Anton, did you have a question?
Yeah, I got a question. So my question is to the whole panel. Assuming, well, not assuming, but we know that the intent of most of those regulations is to improve security. Do we even stand a chance of mandating somehow through an external force that people do a good job with security? Is this whole pursuit hopeless or not? So that's kind of the meta question, I guess.
Anton wants to know if it's worth living or not, basically.
Well, as I mentioned, I do have a family back home. No, really, can you repeat his question?
His question was, do these regulations really stand any chance of mandating security, and will they actually ever work, or do we really have a chance of them working?
Well, I mean, you're already familiar with some of the work products of SC27. They are the grandparents of the 27,000 series of standards. So, you can draw your own conclusions about the effectiveness. All I know is that I and the other experts in this working group are trying really hard to make sure that this particular standard on vulnerability disclosure is meaningful, actionable, and since its focus is based on vendor actions in receiving vulnerability information and handling it and disseminating vulnerability resolution information, we're just doing the best we can to make sure that it's it's easy to understand, especially for vendors who have never done this before. This is really what this what this standard will actually help. We're just fighting our way through the process as best we can. Oh, and actually, by the way, the name of the project just got changed today, so how about that for drama? It's no longer called Responsible Vulnerability Disclosure. Anyone want to guess what it's called now? Please, take a guess.
Irresponsible disclosure?
No, actually, responsible has been dropped from the name, and it is now called Vulnerability Disclosure, which frankly is a much better title for what it actually is. So the problem with changing the title of a standard draft in progress is that it often represents a change in scope, and that's something that usually ends up canceling the project. So it was misnamed in the first place because how can you really define a process in ISO that has, more than one party, and one of the parties actually won't probably be ISO compliant, I'm pretty much guessing. Researchers can do whatever they want. So when we convince the editor to scope this down to affect vendors only and really be a resource for vendors to be able to understand how they're supposed to, in the best circumstances, act when a researcher reports vulnerabilities to them, we tried to get it changed to something reasonable, like guideline for vendors to handle vulnerabilities or something like that, but that would have been a change in scope, which I guess the editor wasn't willing to do. However, we were able to convince the editor to at least drop the responsible from it, because it drops, sort of the morality part of the name of the standard. So anyway, just an FYI, the name has changed. It's now Vulnerability Disclosure.
I think it's totally worth it to actually have these things and move forward with them, because with NERC, for example, I've already seen a decided shift towards security in the industry. It's still got a long way to go, but there is actual, you can see definite proof within various organizations that changes are actually being affected. So I'm not, for all my gnashing of teeth and frustration with that particular document, I'm not one to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think it is actually something that is showing a great deal of improvement in that sector.
Oh, I wasn't sure if we were all going to comment on everyone. I mean, the can or should, right, is a really interesting question, and I think that it's important that we strike this balance. If we look historically about regulation, deregulation, we see this in the shipping industry, we see this in the credit card industry, even before now, right, in terms of interest rates and things like that. There's a constant regulation, deregulation. I've got a relatively nice, I'm slightly biased, blog post on the evolution of regulation, deregulation, and the sine curve that exists. But we are always going to strike a balance in terms of effectiveness. I think that the industries become regulated and then deregulated naturally. Maybe a little bit slightly phase shifted to the right in terms of the timeline. So a little bit after the need is necessary and a little bit after it's no longer necessary. But I think that type of balance happens naturally to a degree.
I do think the regulations, laws, and things can move us forward. I think they do improve. I wish the expectations and understanding of what a piece of paper or a pile of pieces of paper or bits on a, pixels on a screen can actually accomplish were scaled back to something appropriate. But there certainly are enough organizations that are not doing bare minimums and are pushed, to being less negligent. Not being naive here, but we're pushing people to be less negligent. There are people that are always going to try to do the right thing and push forward, and as long as they have the funds to do it, they're going to do it, and they're intellectually challenged by it, and they push. But we've seen with regulations throughout history, unless you mandate mill worker safety, we're killing 8-year-old girls in Lowell. We can push forward, but the problem I have is that we often think that we can solve a problem. We can make it suck